It was a gloomy afternoon, with rain gently tapping against the coffee shop's large windows. The bell above the door chimed softly as an elderly man shuffled in, accompanied by a golden retriever. The dog, Buddy, moved slowly, almost as if sensing his owner's frailty. The man's clothes were worn, his shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. He chose a small table by the corner, lowering himself into the chair with care, while Buddy lay obediently at his feet. The room grew quieter as eyes turned toward them, murmurs spreading among the other customers. The waitress hesitated before approaching. "Sir, I'm sorry, but dogs aren't allowed in here," she said cautiously. The man looked up, his tired blue eyes filled with something deeper than exhaustion. "Please," he whispered, "we won't bother anyone. We just need a moment." His voice cracked slightly, and for a second, the waitress froze, unsure of what to say. But before she could respond, the bell above the door rang again. This time, 2 police officers walked in, their presence commanding attention. "Sir," one officer said firmly, "we've received a complaint about the dog. I'm going to have to ask you both to leave." The man's hand rested protectively on Buddy's head as he sighed deeply. "We'll go," he murmured. "I just wanted one last cup of coffee." But as he moved to stand, the officer's eyes caught something on the table, a worn, slightly crumpled envelope. Inside, a few papers stuck out along with an old photograph. "What's this?" the officer asked, picking up the envelope before the man could stop him. "Please," the man begged, his voice trembling. "It's personal." Ignoring the plea, the officer pulled out the contents and began to read. As his eyes scanned the paper, his expression shifted dramatically, first confusion, then shock. He handed the papers to his partner without saying a word. The second officer read them, his brows furrowing as he looked back at the man. "Sir," the second officer said, his voice softer now, "is this true?" The elderly man didn't answer. Instead, tears began to fall silently down his face as Buddy pressed his head against the man's knee, sensing his pain. The officers exchanged a glance, their faces pale. Whatever they had just discovered on those papers was no small matter. The room was silent, every customer holding their breath as the air grew thick with tension. Something had just been uncovered, something that would change everything. The coffee shop was unnaturally still, as if everyone had stopped breathing. Buddy, the golden retriever, whined softly, sensing the tension that hung heavy in the air. The elderly man, whose frail hands trembled against the table, looked up at the 2 officers with a mix of resignation and despair. The officer holding the envelope hesitated, glancing back at his partner before speaking again. "Sir," he said, his voice quieter now, "we need to know the truth. These documents, they suggest something that can't be ignored." The old man exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking further under the invisible burden he carried. "The truth," he murmured bitterly, shaking his head. "The truth has been chasing me for years. But I suppose it was bound to catch up with me sooner or later." His words, cryptic and filled with sorrow, sent a ripple of unease through the coffee shop. Customers exchanged anxious glances, the murmurs growing louder as curiosity took hold. "Sir, we can't help you if you don't explain," the second officer said, stepping closer but keeping his tone calm. The elderly man's hands went instinctively to Buddy's head, his fingers running through the golden fur as if drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. "Help me?" he said with a bitter chuckle. "There's no help for a man like me. Not after what I've done." His words were heavy, almost final, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. A woman sitting near the counter finally broke the tension. "What exactly has he done?" she demanded, her voice trembling but determined. "If he's dangerous, we deserve to know." Her question was met with silence. The lead officer glanced at the envelope in his hand but didn't respond. Instead, the elderly man raised his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm not dangerous," he said softly. "At least, not anymore." The woman didn't look convinced. "If he's not dangerous, then what are the police doing here?" she pressed, her gaze darting between the officers and the man. But the elderly man ignored her, turning his attention back to the officers. "Buddy doesn't deserve this," he said firmly, his voice breaking. "Whatever happens, promise me he'll be safe. That's all I ask." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions hard to read, but neither of them answered. The tension in the room was suffocating now. Customers sat frozen, caught between fear and curiosity, while the officers deliberated their next move. The elderly man's words lingered in the air, raising more questions than answers. And as Buddy nuzzled his owner's hand, letting out another quiet whimper, it became clear that the weight of what was in that envelope was more than anyone there had anticipated. Something bigger, something life-altering was about to unfold. The silence in the cafe was deafening, broken only by the soft tapping of rain against the windows. The officers stood over the elderly man, their expressions unreadable but clearly tense. The lead officer, still holding the envelope, glanced at his partner before finally addressing the man again. "Sir," he said firmly, "if you want us to help Buddy, if you want us to handle this properly, you need to tell us exactly what's going on. What's written here? It's serious." The elderly man's face seemed to crumble under the weight of those words. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, his hand resting on Buddy's head. "It started years ago," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I was a different man then. Selfish, reckless. I made choices I can't take back, and people got hurt because of them. I thought I could bury the past, move on. But it seems I was wrong." The customers, now fully engrossed, leaned in closer, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. One man at a nearby table muttered, "What the hell did he do?" But no one answered. The officers, too, remained silent, giving the man space to continue. Buddy let out a low, comforting whine, pressing closer to his owner as if urging him to keep going. The man hesitated before continuing, his voice breaking. "The papers in that envelope," he said, glancing toward the officer holding them, "are proof of something I've been running from for decades. A mistake I made, one that ruined lives. And now, after all these years, it's come back to haunt me." He lowered his gaze, his frail hands trembling as they gripped the table's edge. "I never wanted anyone else to find out. I just wanted to live the rest of my days in peace with Buddy." The second officer, who had remained quiet until now, cleared his throat. "You're saying these papers are evidence of a crime?" he asked cautiously, his voice laced with disbelief. The elderly man nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears. "Yes," he whispered, "but it's not as simple as you think. It's not just about me. If those papers get into the wrong hands, it could destroy more lives than it already has." The tension in the room thickened, the weight of his confession settling over everyone like a storm cloud. Customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to think. The lead officer tightened his grip on the envelope, his jaw clenching as he processed what he had just heard. "We need to take you in," he said finally, his voice cold and professional. "We'll figure out the rest at the station." But as the officer reached for the man's arm, Buddy barked sharply, a sound so sudden and fierce that it made everyone in the cafe jump. Whatever was in that envelope wasn't just the man's secret. It was a secret that could shatter everything. Buddy's bark echoed through the cafe, cutting through the suffocating tension like a blade. The golden retriever stood protectively in front of the elderly man, his body tense and his eyes fixed on the officers. The room froze, customers visibly startled by the sudden outburst from the usually calm dog. The elderly man reached out quickly, his hand trembling as he rested it on Buddy's head. "It's okay, boy," he said softly, though his voice carried a hint of desperation. "They're just doing their job." The lead officer took a cautious step back, raising a hand as if to calm the situation. "Sir," he said carefully, "we're not here to hurt you or your dog, but if what you're saying is true, we can't ignore it. We need to take you in so we can figure this out." His tone was measured, but his eyes flicked toward Buddy, clearly uneasy. The second officer, however, remained firm, his gaze steady on the elderly man. "This is bigger than just you, sir," he said. "You said it yourself, those papers could ruin lives. We need to understand the full picture." The elderly man sighed deeply, his fingers still stroking Buddy's fur. His shoulders slumped further, and for a moment, it looked like he might collapse under the weight of everything. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice breaking. "This isn't just about me. There are people out there, powerful people, who will do anything to make sure this stays buried. If you take me in, they'll know the truth is out. And if that happens, more innocent lives could be lost." A murmur rippled through the cafe as customers whispered among themselves, their curiosity and fear growing with each passing second. One man near the counter leaned forward, his voice low but audible. "What the hell is this guy caught up in?" Another customer, a middle-aged woman clutching her coffee cup tightly, looked at the officers and said nervously, "Maybe he's telling the truth. What if taking him in makes things worse?" The officers exchanged a glance, the tension between them clear. The lead officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn. "Sir," he said, his voice softening slightly, "if you're in danger, we can protect you. But we need to know what's going on. Keeping this to yourself won't help anyone. Not you, not Buddy, and not anyone else involved." The elderly man closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Buddy sat back down, resting his head on his owner's knee, his quiet presence a steadying force. Finally, the man opened his eyes, looking directly at the officers. "I'll go with you," he said quietly, "but on one condition. Buddy stays safe. No matter what happens to me, promise me you'll protect him." The officers nodded, but the unease in the air remained. As the man slowly stood, supported by Buddy's steady frame, the room seemed to hold its breath. Whatever truth was about to come to light, it was clear that this story was far from over. The elderly man moved slowly, his frail frame supported by Buddy as he tried to steady himself. The officers stood close, watching his every movement. The cafe patrons remained frozen in their seats, the once warm atmosphere replaced by a heavy sense of dread. A woman near the door whispered to her companion, "Do you think he's dangerous?" Her companion shook her head but said nothing, her eyes fixed on the dog, whose loyalty and calm demeanor told a very different story. As the man took a shaky step toward the door, the lead officer hesitated, his hand still gripping the envelope. Something about the man's words earlier gnawed at him. "Sir," he said, breaking the tense silence, "if these papers are as dangerous as you say, you're not safe either. Whoever you're afraid of, they'll come after you too, won't they?" The man froze mid-step, his expression darkening. "They already have," he said grimly, his voice barely above a whisper. The second officer furrowed his brow. "What do you mean? Has someone threatened you directly?" The elderly man looked down at Buddy, who gazed up at him with unwavering trust. "2 weeks ago," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "someone broke into my home. They didn't take anything, no money, no valuables. But they left a note. It said, 'Stay silent, or you'll lose everything.'" His hand tightened on Buddy's leash. "I know they meant him. Buddy is all I have left." Gasps rippled through the cafe, the customers now fully captivated by the unfolding drama. The middle-aged woman near the counter spoke up again, her voice trembling. "If they've already come after him, shouldn't the police protect him?" she asked, looking directly at the officers. "You can't just take him in without a plan. What if they're watching him right now?" Her words sent a shiver through the room, and several patrons instinctively glanced toward the windows. The lead officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a silent conversation passing between them. "We'll need to get him into protective custody," the second officer finally said. "And we'll need to secure these papers." He tapped the envelope lightly, his face serious. "If these documents are what they seem, they could be the key to exposing whoever's behind this." But the elderly man shook his head. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "These people, they don't just stop. If they find out I'm talking, they'll come for everyone. Not just me. Everyone in this room could be in danger." The cafe fell silent again, the gravity of his words sinking in. Even the officers seemed momentarily at a loss, their professional demeanor cracking under the weight of the situation. Buddy, sensing his owner's distress, let out a soft whimper, leaning against the man's leg. "Please," the man said, looking desperately at the officers. If you take these papers, promise me you'll do whatever it takes to stop them. Not for me, but for everyone they've hurt." The officers nodded, but the unease in their eyes was unmistakable. As they guided the man toward the exit, every person in the cafe watched, the tension thicker than ever. Something far bigger than anyone had anticipated was unfolding, and it was clear that this was only the beginning. The rain outside had turned into a steady downpour, droplets streaming down the cafe windows as the officers carefully escorted the elderly man toward their patrol car. Buddy walked closely at his side, his leash taut as if the dog sensed the danger surrounding them. Inside the cafe, the patrons remained seated, their whispered conversations buzzing with speculation. For many, the surreal scene unfolding before them felt like something pulled straight from a movie. An elderly man, a loyal dog, and an envelope containing secrets capable of shattering lives. As the group reached the car, the lead officer opened the door, motioning for the man to step inside. "Buddy," the elderly man said softly, crouching down despite the pain in his joints, "I need you to trust me now. These people will take care of you." His trembling hands stroked the dog's head, his eyes glistening with tears he could no longer hold back. Buddy whimpered, leaning into him as if trying to resist the separation. The officers hesitated, visibly moved by the bond between them. "Sir," the second officer said, his voice softer than before, "he can come with us for now. We'll figure out a way to keep him safe. But we need to move quickly." The elderly man looked up, surprised, and nodded in relief. He stood, gripping the leash tightly as they guided him into the back seat of the car. Buddy jumped in after him without hesitation, settling close to his owner as if refusing to be apart, no matter the cost. Inside the car, the tension was palpable. The elderly man stared out the window, watching the rain blur the lights of the small town he had called home for decades. The envelope rested in the officer's lap, its contents still a mystery to everyone except the man. "Can I ask you something?" the lead officer said after a few moments of silence. "Why now? Why bring these papers here, of all places?" The man didn't respond immediately. His fingers traced the edges of Buddy's collar as he collected his thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with regret. "Because I couldn't keep running," he said. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of living in fear. I thought, maybe if I came here, had one last coffee, I could find the courage to do what's right." His voice broke, and he looked down at Buddy. "But I didn't expect them to find me so quickly. I thought I had more time." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions grim. The man's words confirmed their worst fears. Whoever he was running from was already closing in. The second officer picked up the radio and called for backup, his voice tense. "We need a secure location," he said. "Now." As the car pulled away from the cafe, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof like a warning. Whatever truth was buried in that envelope, it was clear they were running out of time to uncover it before it was too late. The patrol car cut through the rain-soaked streets, its wipers struggling to keep up with the relentless downpour. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The elderly man sat silently, his hand resting on Buddy's back, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. The officers in the front exchanged occasional glances, their unease growing with every mile. The envelope lay on the dashboard between them, its contents still unread, but carrying an unspoken weight that no one could ignore. As they neared the edge of town, the lead officer broke the silence. "Sir," he said cautiously, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, "we need to know exactly who we're dealing with. If these people are as dangerous as you say, we can't protect you or anyone else without more information." The elderly man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "You don't understand," he murmured. "The less you know, the safer you'll be. These people, they don't leave loose ends." Buddy let out a low growl, his ears perking up as the man spoke. It was as if the dog, too, sensed the gravity of the situation. The second officer, gripping the wheel tightly, glanced at the rearview mirror. "Loose ends or not," he said firmly, "we're already involved. If they know about you, they know about us. And if that's the case, we're all in danger." His voice carried a sharp edge, but underneath it was a flicker of fear he couldn't quite hide. The car suddenly slowed as the lead officer gestured toward a side road. "Take the detour," he instructed. "We need to get him somewhere safe before we sort this out." The second officer nodded, turning onto the narrow, dimly lit road that cut through a wooded area. The rain had turned the path into a slick maze, and every shadow outside seemed to shift ominously in the headlights. The elderly man tensed, his fingers curling tighter around Buddy's leash. "I don't think this is safe," the man said abruptly, his voice laced with alarm. "They're always watching. They'll know we've left the main road." The officers exchanged a quick glance, but before they could respond, a sharp noise echoed in the distance. A loud crack, like a tree branch snapping under pressure. Buddy bolted upright, his ears pinned back and a deep growl rumbling in his chest. The second officer hit the brakes instinctively, and the car skidded slightly before coming to a halt. "What was that?" the lead officer asked, his hand already reaching for his weapon. The elderly man's breathing quickened as he clutched Buddy close. "It's them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "They've found us." The officers scanned the dark woods outside, the tension in the car escalating with every second. The envelope on the dashboard seemed to pulse with significance, a silent reminder that whatever was inside it had just made them all targets. The patrol car sat motionless on the slick, muddy road, the rain pounding relentlessly on the roof. Inside, the tension was suffocating. The second officer scanned the dark woods ahead, his hand gripping the wheel tightly. "Could have been a branch," he muttered, though his voice betrayed his doubt. The lead officer was less convinced. His hand hovered over his sidearm as he carefully opened the glove compartment, retrieving a flashlight. "Stay alert," he instructed. "We don't take chances here." Buddy's growl deepened, his golden fur bristling as he stared out the window. The elderly man placed a hand on the dog's back, his touch both calming and desperate. "He knows," the man said softly. "Buddy always knows when danger's close." His words sent a chill through the car, the certainty in his tone too unsettling to dismiss. The lead officer clicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the heavy rain, and opened the car door cautiously. As the officer stepped out, the rain drenched him instantly. The flashlight beam swept across the narrow road and into the dense woods. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain and the rustling of wet leaves. Then, there it was again, a sharp crack closer this time. The officer froze, his flashlight fixed on a shadow that flickered between the trees. "We're not alone out here," he called back to the car, his voice tense but controlled. Inside, the elderly man's breathing quickened. "We have to move," he urged, clutching Buddy's leash tightly. "Sitting here makes us sitting ducks. They'll close in before you even realize it." The second officer hesitated, his fingers twitching over the gear shift. "And go where?" he shot back, his frustration laced with fear. "We're in the middle of nowhere, and they clearly know how to find us." The lead officer took another step forward, his flashlight darting back and forth. Then he saw it, a figure partially hidden by the trees, wearing a dark raincoat. The officer raised his hand, shouting, "Police! Step out where I can see you." The figure didn't move, the rain obscuring any details. A second passed, then another. Suddenly, the shadow darted to the left, disappearing deeper into the woods. "He's on the move," the lead officer shouted, turning back to the car. "Stay inside and lock the doors." But before he could take off in pursuit, Buddy barked loudly, the sound sharp and urgent. The elderly man tugged at the leash, panic in his eyes. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. That's not just one of them. They never come alone." The second officer froze, his eyes flicking to the surrounding woods. As if on cue, more shadows began to emerge, slipping through the trees like predators circling their prey. The trap had already been sprung. The woods seemed to close in around the patrol car, the figures moving through the rain like phantoms. The lead officer turned back to the car, his flashlight sweeping frantically across the trees as his free hand hovered near his weapon. "We're surrounded," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Stay in the car." He barked at the elderly man and his partner. Inside, the tension was unbearable. Buddy stood rigid, his growl turning into sharp barks that echoed through the small space. The elderly man's grip on the leash tightened as he tried to calm the dog. "It's them," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're here for the envelope. They won't stop until they get it." His words sent a chill through the second officer, who instinctively reached for the envelope on the dashboard. "We can't let them have this," the second officer said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. He turned to the elderly man. "Is there anything in here we can use to bargain with? A way to stop this?" The man shook his head slowly, despair etched into his face. "You don't bargain with them," he said. "They don't care about deals or lives. The only thing they want is silence." The lead officer shouted again, this time drawing his weapon. "Step out where I can see you. Last warning." His flashlight beam caught a glint of metal, a weapon, before the shadow ducked behind a tree. The officer fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the gun echoing through the storm. But it did little to deter the figures creeping closer. Inside the car, Buddy barked furiously, lunging toward the window as if trying to protect his owner. The elderly man grabbed the dog's collar, pulling him back. "If they get the envelope," he said, looking at the second officer with a mixture of desperation and determination, "you'll never stop them. You have to protect it at all costs." The second officer nodded grimly, tucking the envelope inside his vest as he grabbed the radio. "This is Officer Daniels," he said into the radio, his voice tight. "We're under attack on Forest Ridge Road. Multiple suspects, requesting immediate backup." Static crackled in response, followed by a faint reply. "Backup on route, ETA 15 minutes. Daniels cursed under his breath and looked at the elderly man. "We don't have 15 minutes, do we?" The man's silence was answer enough. Outside, the shadows grew bolder, closing the distance as the rain fell harder. Time was running out and everyone in the car knew it. The patrol car felt like a fragile sanctuary in the midst of a brewing storm. Outside, the figures moved closer, their shapes shifting in the shadows of the trees, illuminated sporadically by lightning flashes. Buddy's barking became relentless, his body pressed against the car door as if ready to defend his owner at all costs. The elderly man pulled the dog back, his voice shaking. "Buddy, stay calm. Stay with me." But even he knew the dog's instincts were right. Danger was mere moments away. The lead officer crouched near the hood of the car, his gun drawn, scanning the tree-line for movement. His flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the downpour. "Show yourselves," he shouted into the darkness. A response came, not in words, but in the form of another glint of metal. A blade or a gun, it was impossible to tell. He fired a warning shot into the trees, the crack of the gun briefly silencing Buddy's barks. "They're testing us," he muttered, his adrenaline surging. Inside the car, the second officer clutched the radio, desperate for a clearer response. "Backup, ETA now," he yelled into the static. The reply came through, faint but clear. 5 minutes. Daniels clenched his jaw and looked at the elderly man. "They'll be here soon. Just hold tight." But the man's expression was grim. 5 minutes is too long," he said quietly. "If they reach us before your backup does, it's over." Lightning lit up the woods again, and this time, one of the figures stepped forward, partially visible through the rain. The person wore a dark hood, their face obscured, but the presence was menacing. "Hand it over," a voice shouted, sharp and commanding. "You don't know what you're involved in." The lead officer stood firm, his gun aimed directly at the figure. "Stay back," he warned, his voice unwavering. The elderly man reached for the envelope in Daniel's vest, his hands trembling. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "You can't let them take this. It's not just about me. It's about everyone they've hurt, everyone they'll hurt if this doesn't come out." His eyes locked with the officer's, pleading. "Promise me, no matter what happens, you'll get this to someone who can stop them, Daniels hesitated, the weight of the man's words crashing down on him. Before he could respond, there was a loud bang, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. The windshield of the patrol car shattered, shards of glass flying into the cabin. Buddy barked furiously, leaping in front of the elderly man as if to shield him. "Get down!" Daniels shouted, grabbing the envelope and diving out of the car. The lead officer fired into the woods, his movements quick and precise. The figures began to close in, their shadows stretching like predators circling prey. The fight had begun, and survival was now the only goal.